This next video is all about inflammation and fever, which the science term for fever is pyrexia. So this video, we're going to talk about these two components of our second line of defense. So just a reminder, this current series is on our non-specific or innate immune responses. So this means if a pathogen gets past our first line of defense, skin, mucous membranes, etc., we're going to be talking about two processes that happen immediately. As soon as something is detected in the body, these are some of the processes that are going to happen. The last video, we talked about interferons, which are little molecules that virally infected cells release to kind of warn uninfected cells, other infected cells, and third lines of defense. And then we also talked about the process of phagocytosis, which is going to be the process of kind of hunting down and eliminating pathogens. So phagocytosis is actually going to play a role in this next process that we're talking about, which is inflammation. So most of us have probably experienced inflammation at one point or another. A lot of times it happens if you kind of have like a parenteral transmission of a pathogen, or even if a pathogen isn't involved, right? If you get a splinter or if you accidentally prick your finger on something, right? It's going to get red, warm, it's going to swell, it's going to have some pain associated with it. In other words, it becomes inflamed. And even though it's kind of an annoying process sometimes, it is very beneficial because the whole purpose of inflammation is to isolate the pathogen. Essentially, it kind of quarantines them so that our phagocytic cells can get to them and eliminate them, okay? And so, as I just mentioned, there are a few key indicators of inflammation. So make sure you know the common definition and the science word. And so as we kind of go through the steps of inflammation, I think these indicators are going to make more sense, okay? So inflammation begins when there's some sort of breach of the skin. So again, maybe you've gotten a splinter. And so what's going to happen is right below the surface of the skin are mast cells. And mast cells, when there's a breach in the skin, they release histamine. And that's going to be what initiates this whole process, histamine, which should make sense, right? Because if you have like allergies or you get congested, we take an antihistamine to try to reduce the inflammation, okay? So mast cells release histamine. That kicks off this process because that is going to cause vasodilation, which means blood vessels are going to expand and become larger. This is going to cause an increase in blood flow and circulation, which is going to be where the redness and warmth comes from, and also vascular permeability. And so that's going to allow fluid and things to kind of seep into neighboring tissues. That's going to cause the swelling. And as those tissues kind of swell a little bit, it can put some pressure on nerve endings, which is where the pain comes from. And so the vasodilation, even though it can result in the tumor indolor, it's very, very beneficial because, and I know in this video, the captions are covering the kind of before picture, but you'll notice in that image, if you look at your PowerPoints, by having those vessels swell, yes, it's going to allow more blood flow, but it's going to allow the white blood cells, especially phagocytic cells, to travel more quickly to the site of infection. And that process, that traveling of the white blood cells, that process is called margination. And I think of that like it sounds like marching. You can kind of imagine those white blood cells marching to the site of infection. So it's margination. Once they get to where it's at, they've got to squeeze through. As you can see right here, you can see that phagocytic cell trying to squeeze through so it can actually get to where the pathogen is at. That little squeezing process is called diapedesis. And once those phagocytic cells are able to squeeze through that interstitial space, then, excuse me, then it's going to be able to get to the pathogen. It's going to do phagocytosis, where it's going to ingest them and digest them. Once the pathogens have been cleared, any dead cells can be removed as well, and then tissue repair can start to happen, right? That's really important. We don't want to walk around with big holes in our body. So once the pathogen is cleared, then the repair process can begin. So this is a really good picture. I apologize, I should have scooched it up before pushing record. But essentially, what you see here is something like a nail breaking the skin. Notice these mast cells here are, sorry, those aren't mast cells, where are they? Right down here, histamine has been released, okay? And so that has caused vasodilation to occur. And so you can see our phagocytic cells here traveling through these expanded vessels called margination. Here you can see one squeezing through, that's called diapedesis. And once they're there, they are phagocytosing and eliminating these bacteria. Okay, so kind of from the top, breach of the skin triggers mast cells to release antihistamine. That's going to cause blood vessels to expand, which is called vasodilation. This allows, oxygen, nutrients, red blood cells, and things to move quickly to the site of infection, but it also allows the immune cells, our white blood cells, to quickly travel to the site of infection, which is called margination. They then squeeze through the cells lining the blood vessels in a process called diapedesis, which allows them to actually interact with the pathogen, where they can do phagocytosis to ingest and digest that pathogen. After that, tissue repair can happen. So it's kind of in a nutshell, there is inflammation. Next up is pyrexia, which is the snazzy science term for fever. Technically, when the body hits 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit, we say that the body has a fever, or is experiencing a fever. And so kind of at the heart of causing a fever are pyrogens. And these are little cellular messengers like cytokines that are alerting the hypothalamus, the part of the brain that kind of acts like the thermostat, that, hey, there's a problem. Okay, there's an infection. We're going to need to kind of crank up the heat a little bit. Okay. And so we actually have two types of pyrogens that are critical for this process. First are exogenous pyrogens. So by now, hopefully you're familiar with exo, meaning like outside of, sounds like exit. So exogenous pyrogens are little molecules that come from outside of the host. That means they're made by the pathogen. These are things that our body detects and are like, wait a minute, you should not be here. Okay, so an example would be the endotoxin, LPS, from gram-negative pathogens. Those should not really be hanging out in our body, right? So that would be an exogenous pyrogen. That's something that's alerting our body that, hey, we've got a problem and we may need to crank up the temperature a little bit to get rid of it. We also have endogenous pyrogens, which are molecules produced by the human host that are meant to actually get to kind of really induce the fever process. So what happens to actually induce a fever? So the body is going to detect that exogenous pyrogen. Remember, that's part of the pathogen. And the leukocytes, our white blood cells, are going to release a type of cytokine called an interleukin. These interleukins circulate in the blood, make their way up to the hypothalamus, which is going to secrete a prostaglandin, or more than one. And it's these prostaglandins that actually reset the hypothalamus. It kind of tricks it into thinking that the body is too cool. So the hypothalamus is going to be like, oops, my bad. And it's going to initiate responses in the body that will ultimately raise the body temperature. So we're going to essentially detect a problem, which is the exogenous pyrogen. Those cells that detect the problem are going to release a signaling molecule, a type of cytokine called an interleukin. That's going to be what makes its way up to the hypothalamus, causes it to secrete those prostaglandins, which eventually is going to cause the body to increase the temperature. But how does it do that? What actually happens to the body that causes our temperature to increase? Well, one thing is going to be peripheral vasoconstriction. So this is where those blood vessels are going to contract. We're trying to reduce the amount of blood flow up to the surface of the skin because that's where a lot of body heat gets released, right, at the surface of the skin. So we're trying to minimize that. So we want to keep all the temperatures inside of us, all the heat. That didn't make any sense. Sorry. We want to keep all the heat inside the body. Shivering, or also called chills, will occur, right? Because the more we shiver, the more we move. The more we move, right, the faster molecules move, the hotter it gets, right? So again, we're trying to crank up the heat inside the body. There's also hormones released from the thyroid that specifically increase the rate of certain metabolic reactions. Because remember, with all those little reactions, what do they naturally give off as a byproduct? Heat energy. Okay, so these are three ways that we're kind of making more heat occur, but we're also keeping that heat trapped in the body. We're trying not to let it go to our extremities or get to the surface of the skin. So why do we want a fever? Well, remember in Unit 2, we talked about a lot of pathogens are mesophiles, meaning they grow best at our normal 37 degrees Celsius body temperature. Well, if we make it so that our body is warmer than that, we can make it so that their pathogenic proteins and things are going to start to denature and the organism won't be able to survive. A higher body temperature also causes our heart rate to increase, which is going to allow those leukocytes and white blood cells to move more quickly to the sites of infection. It's going to allow things like phagocytosis to occur more quickly. We also have talked about, the warmer it is, the faster enzymes can work. Now, of course, there is a certain point where a fever becomes dangerous for us, okay? So we can only crank up the heat so much, all right? But initially, as we start to raise the temperature, those enzymes can work a little faster. There's also a physiological response that we tend to get more tired as our body temperature increases. And so, excuse me, that means if we feel more tired, we're going to rest. That way, all of the cell's energy is able to go towards fighting the infection, okay? Because when you're just walking around or out running errands, right, you're using that energy to walk and move and pick things up. Well, your body, when it's fighting infection, needs all the energy it can to just fighting the infection. Oh, sorry, y'all. Oh, wait, did I go there right? Oh my gosh, I'm pushing the wrong button. Sorry, y'all. Okay, last one. This is going to increase B cell and T cell activation. Now, we haven't talked about those yet, but those are the main components of our third line of defense, okay? So you'll notice some of the consequences of our second line of defense are to activate the third line of defense. Because should the second line of defense not eliminate the pathogen, we want our third line of defense to kind of be on the ready, right? So they can jump in and help if need be. Now going the right way. All right, y'all, this slide, you don't need to memorize this. This is an FYI because a lot of you either have kids, know kids, work with kids, right? Or want to if you go into a healthcare profession. A lot of people at the first sign of a fever kind of panic, and that's understandable, right? You don't want your child to feel bad. You don't want them to be warmer than necessary. It can just kind of automatically induce a little bit of panic. But it turns out a low-grade fever, okay, that means up to about 102 degrees, is actually the most beneficial to a child and to adults as well. Okay, so you want to keep the fever between 100 to 102 degrees because this is where the human body is okay, right? Our enzymes are working a little faster. hopefully getting children a little more tired so that they'll lay low and let their body heal. They're okay, healthy and fine about this point. All right, so if it gets up to about a moderate grade fever, that can still be okay. But 104 is where you want to kind of be keeping your eye on. You want to keep it right under 104, sorry, under 104 degrees. Once you hit at about 104 degrees, that's where we call this a high fever. This can be pretty uncomfortable. For the most part, it's harmless, okay? But let me make a little caveat here. For a short period of time, you don't want your child at 104-degree fever, right, for a very long time, okay? And so if it gets any higher than that, you want to be talking to your doctor, okay? Now, of course, there's exceptions to every rule. Every child is different, okay? Prolonged high fevers can be dangerous. So it's recommended, if that fever is creeping up on 104, I would go ahead and call your doctor, as they'll be happy to advise you. What I really want the take-home message to be here, y'all, is try to avoid fever reducers at the first sign of a fever. Because what happens if you temporarily reduce a fever? Kids feel better, they want to go outside and play, exert all this energy. So when the medicine wears off, right, suddenly the fever is back with a vengeance, okay? The bacteria have often been able to multiply pretty rapidly, and it can really just do more harm than good, okay? And so again, monitor the fever, talk to a healthcare professional if you are concerned, which is totally understandable, but just please try to avoid the fever reducer as soon as a low-grade fever is detected, okay? All right, y'all, that is it for this video. Let me know if you have any questions.